And one of the reasons they're such a destructive species is because it can lay about 1,200 eggs on average.
What if the creature that once wiped out entire rice harvests and pushed millions of farmers to the edge is now being deliberately raised to feed fish, ducks, and entire rural households? That's exactly what's happening in Vietnam right now. A small, shiny snail that once terrorized the Asian continent by destroying rice fields is now being cultivated across the Mekong Delta coastline. And the people who once fought these snails are now making money from them. This is the story of how Vietnam transformed one of agriculture's most notorious invaders into a surprising source of income. Let's get into it. Asia's rice destroyer. To understand just how wild this turnaround is, you need to go back to the beginning and understand what the golden apple snail actually did to Asian agriculture. The golden apple snail, scientifically known as Pomachia canaliculata, is native to South America. It was brought to Asia in the early 1980s, first to the Philippines, then to Taiwan, with genuinely good intentions. It was marketed as a cheap, high-protein food source that could help feed rural communities. For a moment, companies made huge profits, jobs opened up, and everything looked like a booming success. Then everything went wrong. The snail turned out to be far more destructive than useful as a food item. Because so many people didn't like its taste, farms started to abandon their operations. And when that happened, the snails didn't just disappear. They were released or escaped into canals, rivers, and flooded rice paddies, where they found conditions almost perfectly designed for them to explode in population. Now, here's the thing about snails. A single female golden apple snail can lay egg masses containing up to 500 eggs once a week. Those bright pink egg clusters are laid above the waterline, out of reach of fish and most predators. They hatch into snails that are immediately capable of destroying young rice seedlings. A single adult can consume 7 to 24 rice seedlings per day. In a heavily infested field, that kind of feeding pressure is devastating. The snail was so aggressive that by the year 2000, the International Union for Conservation of Nature listed it as one of the world's 100 worst invasive alien species. That's a list nobody wants to be on. And nowhere did this explosion hit harder than in Vietnam. Vietnam's ground zero. Vietnam didn't import the golden apple snail. It inherited it through the region's water systems and then made the same mistake itself. The snail was imported into Vietnam between 1985 and 1988, officially for the purpose of raising it as a human food source. From 1990 to 1993, the Vietnamese media promoted apple snail farming as a business opportunity that could bring prosperity to farmers. People rushed to find snails and raise them in ponds, lakes, and household enclosures. Large-scale farms opened in Ho Chi Minh City and Kiên Giang Province. Then all of a sudden, the demand collapsed. The snails didn't sell the way anyone hoped, and instead of safely disposing of the excess, snails were released or escaped into the country's vast interconnected water systems. From there, they spread at a speed that alarmed everyone. By November 1994, just a few years after those farms shut down, the snail had already spread across 38 provinces, damaging 1,678 hectares of rice fields and another 140 hectares of vegetables. But the situation only got worse. By 1998, the infestation had reached 57 of Vietnam's 61 provinces and cities, spreading into 304 districts nationwide. In the Mekong Delta alone, more than 1.8 million hectares of rice fields were affected. At some places, infestations reached 50 to 200 snails per square meter of rice field. At those densities, farmers weren't just losing part of their crop, they were watching seedlings disappear overnight. What made it even harder to control is that when water disappears from fields, the snails simply bury themselves in the mud and hibernate for up to 6 months. When water returns, they emerge again as if nothing happened. Chemical molluscicides were widely used, but they were expensive, often ineffective at the scale needed, and damaging to fish, birds, and other wildlife in the paddy ecosystem. For years, the battle seemed impossible to win. But eventually, farmers in the Mekong Delta stopped asking how to eliminate the snail entirely and started asking a very different question. What if the infestation itself could become an opportunity? Flood season opportunity. Vietnam's Mekong Delta floods every year, usually between August and November. For rice farmers, it's a difficult period. Fields go underwater, planting slows, and much of the agricultural cycle pauses. But the golden apple snails don't pause with it. In fact, flood season creates perfect conditions for them. As the waters recede, the snails cling to grass, branches, and nearby vegetation, reproducing rapidly in the shallow, stagnant water left behind. In some years, their population explodes, coating entire canals and rice fields in massive numbers. And that is exactly when Vietnamese communities started realizing something. These snails have a market. During the flood season, people across the Mekong Delta began going out in small boats at night to collect golden apple snails from fields and canals. Traders started buying them directly. Buyers like Vo Van Phat, a snail buyer in the Delta region, reported purchasing 30 to 60 tons of snails per day during peak flood season, at prices of around 2,000 to 2,500 Vietnamese dong per kilogram. Workers hired to carry and sort snails earned between 300,000 and 500,000 dong per day, a meaningful income for rural laborers. The snails were collected, processed, and transported to shrimp and fish farming households in other provinces, who used them as a cheap, protein-rich feed source. What was being removed from the rice fields as a pest control measure was now becoming a commodity. This wasn't organized farming yet. It was opportunistic harvesting, but it planted a very important idea in the minds of farmers across the Delta. The golden apple snail has value. And if it has value, maybe it doesn't have to be just a pest. And once money entered the picture, people started asking a very different question. What exactly is this thing worth? The hidden nutritional value. Before we get into how deliberate farming developed, it helps to understand why anyone would want to farm this creature in the first place. Because the golden apple snail turns out to be genuinely impressive from a nutritional standpoint. The reason farmers started seeing value in the golden apple snail is simple. It's packed with protein. Depending on how it's processed, the meat contains around 39% to 68% protein by dry weight, close to the nutritional quality of fish meal, one of the most important ingredients in aquaculture feed. Tests on catfish also showed protein digestibility above 92%, making the snail a surprisingly effective and low-cost feed source. Even the shells turned out to be useful. The shells of golden apple snails contain around 41% calcium, making them valuable for poultry and livestock feed. Farmers can grind the shells into meal and use them as a cheaper alternative to oyster shell, helping improve eggshell quality and bone strength in ducks and chickens. The meat proved just as valuable. Studies showed that golden apple snail meal could partially replace expensive fish meal in the diets of shrimp, catfish, tilapia, freshwater prawns, and several other farmed species without hurting growth. Duck farmers saw promising results too. In some feeding trials, snail meat replaced up to 40% of fish meal in duck diets, while other studies found it could even improve egg production. For Vietnam, this mattered enormously. Aquaculture is one of the country's biggest industries, and feed alone can make up more than half the cost of shrimp farming. So suddenly, this destructive, invasive snail was no longer just a pest. It was a cheap, local source of protein and calcium. And that's when the idea changed completely. Instead of simply harvesting the snails from the wild, people began farming them on purpose. From pest to farming. In an earlier era, Deliberately farming the golden apple snail in Vietnam would have seemed like a reckless idea. The government had spent years trying to suppress its spread, using molluscicides, encouraging duck integration in paddies, and running community snail collection campaigns, all of it aimed at reducing the snail population. But something changed when farmers started watching their neighbors earn a steady income from snail collection and sale. Some began experimenting with controlled pond cultivation of the snail, not in rice fields, where it would cause damage, but in dedicated aquaculture ponds, away from crops. Raising apple snails in controlled ponds turns out to be manageable. The snails are easy to maintain. Their primary food sources include duckweed and vegetables, cheap and often freely available. Their growth period is short. They are less susceptible to disease than many other aquaculture species. And most importantly, in a controlled pond environment, they cannot escape into rice fields and cause damage. In many communities where this model has taken hold, concentrated snail production areas formed as farmers learned from each other. Traders began supplying snail juveniles directly to farmers. At harvest time, buyers came to the ponds to purchase, making the process convenient. Products were sold to traders, restaurants, and feed buyers in multiple provinces. Farmers who combined 2 snail crops with 1 fish crop per year on the same pond area reported total revenue of approximately 1 billion Vietnamese dong per hectare. That is a meaningful amount of money in the Mekong Delta, especially for rural families where job opportunities can be limited. For years, many working-age people have been leaving the region to find work in larger cities. So a farming model that creates steady local income has become increasingly important for communities trying to hold on to their livelihoods. Local authorities and farmers' associations have started formalization programs, providing loans, training, and guidance on water management, breed selection, and disease prevention. The model is spreading, and it is doing so not because the golden apple snail is no longer a pest, it very much still is in rice fields, but because Vietnamese farmers have found a way to channel its reproduction and growth into a controlled system that generates income rather than crop loss. But long before ponds and formal farms, farmers were already quietly building a system around it. Duck rice snail system. Long before people started farming golden apple snails intentionally, many Vietnamese farmers had already found a practical way to turn this pest into something useful. They used ducks. In parts of the Mekong Delta, farmers began releasing ducks into rice paddies once the rice plants were strong enough to survive snail damage, usually about 30 to 40 days after transplanting. At that stage, the stems become tougher, and the ducks can safely roam the fields without harming the crop. The ducks immediately went after the snails. Golden apple snails, especially young ones, became an easy source of protein-rich food. As the ducks fed, they naturally reduced the snail population in the paddies, helping farmers control infestations without relying heavily on chemicals. And the benefits didn't stop there. Farmers noticed that ducks raised in these systems often gained weight faster and produced healthier eggs because of the protein-rich diet. At the same time, spending on molluscicides dropped, reducing farming costs. The system created a simple but highly effective cycle. The snails fed the ducks controlled the pests, and their droppings fertilized the rice fields. What emerged was an early form of circular agriculture long before the term became popular. Instead of treating the invasive snail as pure waste, farmers folded it back into the farming ecosystem in a way that improved productivity on multiple levels. Research later confirmed what farmers had already discovered through experience. Studies on rice duck farming systems showed that ducks could significantly reduce golden apple snail populations in rice paddies. Agricultural programs across Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, began promoting the method as a low-cost and environmentally friendly alternative to chemical control. For small farmers, the appeal was obvious. The model required little investment, no advanced machinery, and no complicated technology. Farmers could protect their rice, raise ducks for meat or eggs, and lower pest control costs at the same time. It wasn't a perfect solution. The snails never disappeared completely, but farmers no longer needed to eliminate them entirely. They only needed to keep the population under control while extracting value from it. That shift in thinking changed everything. The golden apple snail stopped being viewed only as an agricultural disaster and started becoming part of a working rural economy. And eventually, that same idea expanded beyond rice fields and ducks into commercial aquaculture itself. Snail as fish feed. The golden apple snail's role in Vietnam didn't stop with ducks roaming rice paddies. Before industrial fish feed became dominant, many Vietnamese fish farmers were already using snails as a cheap source of protein in aquaculture, especially in Pangasius catfish farming across the Mekong Delta. The logic was simple. The snails were everywhere. Farmers could collect them directly from rice fields at little to no cost, grind them up, and mix them into homemade fish feed. For many small aquaculture operations, it was an easy way to reduce dependence on expensive commercial feed, and it worked surprisingly well. Farmers who used snail-based feed reported noticeably lower production costs while still maintaining healthy fish growth. Some studies found that feed expenses could drop by around 8% to 10% compared to relying entirely on commercial pellets. Researchers studying the Mekong Delta's aquaculture systems documented the practice clearly. Rice field pests were being recycled into fish feed on a large scale. It was practical, local, and inexpensive. But over time, the industry changed. As Vietnam became one of the world's largest seafood exporters, international buyers began demanding stricter food safety standards and more standardized feed ingredients. Large commercial farms gradually shifted toward industrial pelleted feeds that were easier to regulate and trace. Even so, the idea of using golden apple snails never completely disappeared. In recent years, researchers across Vietnam and Southeast Asia have started revisiting the snail more seriously as feed costs continue to rise worldwide. Modern studies have analyzed its protein content, digestibility, and suitability as a replacement for fish meal in aquaculture diets, and the results have remained remarkably consistent. Golden apple snail meal performs well in feeds for catfish, tilapia, shrimp, and several other farmed species. For an industry constantly searching for cheaper and more sustainable protein sources, that makes the snail increasingly difficult to ignore. That matters because fish meal itself has become expensive and unpredictable. Aquaculture producers around the world are under pressure to find alternatives that are both affordable and environmentally sustainable, and Vietnam may already be sitting on one. What was once considered one of the country's worst agricultural pests is now being reconsidered as a standardized feed ingredient with real commercial potential. But turning an invasive species into an industry creates a difficult dilemma, because the moment a pest becomes profitable, people don't want it to disappear. Invasive farming risks. But there's an obvious problem with all of this. The golden apple snail is still one of the world's most destructive invasive species. No matter how useful it becomes as feed or livestock protein, the risk never disappears. If farmed snails escape back into rice paddies, they can rapidly rebuild wild populations and start damaging crops again. And in the Mekong Delta, escape is not difficult. Flooding is common, waterways are interconnected, and early snail farmers often struggled with poor pond management. In some cases, heavy rains and flooding washed snails directly into canals and nearby agricultural land. So the danger is very real. That's why Vietnamese agricultural authorities and researchers have pushed for tighter control over how the snails are farmed. In many areas, production is limited to contained ponds with barriers designed to prevent escape into surrounding waterways. Local farming groups and agricultural departments also coordinate where snail farming can take place, especially near sensitive rice-growing regions. At the same time, some researchers argue that giving the snail economic value may actually help control it. Instead of ignoring infestations, Farmers now have a reason to actively collect the snails from fields, canals, and flooded areas. During flood season, especially, large-scale harvesting can remove huge numbers from the environment while also generating income. Whether that truly reduces long-term pest pressure is still being studied. But one thing is already clear. Once the snail became profitable, people started managing it very differently. For decades, the goal was simple eradication. Now, the goal is control, containment, and extraction of value. And that shift reflects something larger happening across rural Vietnam. Communities that once saw the snail only as a disaster are now trying to integrate it into local farming systems in ways that reduce waste, lower costs, and create income at the same time. It's a complicated balance. The same species that once threatened food security is now helping support parts of the rural economy, and that contradiction sits at the center of Vietnam's entire relationship with the golden apple snail. So Vietnam looked at a snail that had spent decades destroying rice crops, infesting millions of hectares of farmland, and resisting repeated attempts at chemical control, and found a way to make it useful. Not by eliminating the snail, but by changing the relationship between farmers and the pest from pure conflict into something far more complicated and far more productive. So, what do you think about this? Could this model of farming invasive species for food and feed become a real global strategy? Or does it just make the invasive problem worse in the long run? Let us know in the comments below. And if you liked this video, ensure you give it a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, because we will be uploading more crazy stories like this one in the coming weeks. Until then, see ya.